Every disaster begins before anyone realizes it has already started. At dawn on May 5, 1945, the ridge at Hacksaw was quiet in a way that felt temporary. Smoke hung low over shattered ground. Bodies lay where they had fallen the day before. Most units had already pulled back. The order had been given. The position was considered lost. One man stayed. He did not carry a rifle. He never had. He carried bandages, morphine, and a rope. He was a combat medic, alone on a cliff where artillery and machine gun fire had turned withdrawal into survival by chance. If he failed to move the wounded before the next attack, they would not live long enough for anyone to come back. His name was Desmond Doss. He was not supposed to be there, not by temperament, not by training, not by the expectations of the men around him. He was a Seventh-day Adventist, raised to believe that taking a life under any circumstances was wrong. When the United States entered the war, he volunteered anyway, not to fight, but to serve as a medic. He refused to touch a weapon. He refused to train with one. He refused even when officers told him it would end his career before it began. The Army did not know what to do with him. Other soldiers thought he was dangerous. A man who would not carry a rifle was seen as someone who would not protect the unit. He was mocked, isolated, threatened, and accused of cowardice. He was court-martialed and nearly discharged. He did not change his position. He did not argue loudly. He simply stayed. When his unit reached Okinawa, the fighting stripped away theory. The terrain was vertical, exposed, and lethal. Hacksaw Ridge rose sharply from the valley floor, a sheer escarpment that had to be climbed by cargo net under fire. Japanese defenses were layered and concealed, assaults stalled, casualties mounted, medics were overwhelmed. Doss climbed the ridge with the rest. When the attack collapsed and the order came to retreat, he did not go down. He stayed among the wounded scattered across the top of the escarpment, exposed to fire from multiple directions. He worked methodically, no shouting, no heroics. He treated one man at a time, stopping bleeding, stabilizing fractures, administering morphine where he could. Then he dragged them. Each wounded soldier had to be moved to the edge of the cliff and lowered by rope, one by one, 75 feet down, into the relative safety below. Doss tied knots with hands already shaking from exhaustion. He prayed quietly between each descent, asking for strength to get just one more. Japanese troops moved through the area during the night. Artillery continued to fall. Doss avoided detection by staying low and working in silence. He was wounded himself, hit by shrapnel in the leg. Later, a grenade blast fractured his arm. He treated himself quickly and continued until there was no one else he could find alive. By the time he descended, he had been awake and working for nearly 12 hours under continuous threat. Estimates later placed the number of men he saved at 75. Doss himself never gave a number. He said he only did what needed to be done. His actions did not end the battle. Hacksaw Ridge was taken later at heavy cost. But the men who survived that night did so because one medic refused to leave them behind. When Doss was awarded the Medal of Honor, it was the first time it had been given to a conscientious objector. The citation did not mention religion. It did not mention refusal. It listed actions, distances, wounds, and time under fire. He had carried no weapon. He had fired no shots. He had not killed anyone. In a war defined by violence, Desmond Doss demonstrated a different form of courage. Not defiance, not rebellion, persistence. The decision to stay where leaving would have been easier. To keep moving when stopping would have been understandable. He did not change the nature of war. But on one ridge for one night, he changed the outcome for 75 men who lived because someone chose not to walk away. The men he lowered down the face of the ridge did not see the whole of what he was doing. Most were unconscious. Others were barely aware of where they were. Few understood that the medic pulling them across open ground and tying the rope around their bodies was the same man they had once avoided in camp. Word spread only after daylight. As the unit regrouped below the escarpment, names were called and answered that should not have been answered at all. Men who had been listed as missing appeared, bandaged, alive. Officers realized that far more wounded had come down than anyone expected. When asked how so many had been evacuated after the retreat, the answer was consistent. Doss had stayed. The skepticism that had followed him since training did not disappear immediately. War does not revise opinion quickly. But it shifted. The men who had doubted him now measured courage differently, not by aggression or volume, but by presence, by who remained when orders allowed withdrawal. Doss returned to the line days later, his injuries treated just enough to function. He continued to work as a medic under fire, exposed and unarmed, moving toward casualties while others moved away from them. On one occasion, he was hit by a sniper while treating another soldier and used his own body to shield the wounded man until help arrived. Even then, he did not seek recognition. He did not describe his actions as exceptional. When asked later why he stayed on the ridge, his explanation remained simple. He believed that if someone was alive, it was his responsibility to try to help them. The rest followed from that premise. The Army, which had once tried to remove him, now documented his actions carefully. Statements were collected, timelines reconstructed, distances measured. The account did not grow more dramatic with repetition. If anything, it became more restrained. The facts were sufficient on their own. After Okinawa, the war ended. Doss returned home physically diminished, suffering from tuberculosis and lasting injuries that would affect him for the rest of his life. He never claimed to be unchanged by what he had seen. He never claimed certainty. He spoke instead about faith as discipline, not comfort, as something that held when fear did not recede. The Medal of Honor ceremony was brief. He stood in uniform, thin and quiet, as the citation was read. The applause did not alter his expression. The recognition did not change how he described himself. He said he had simply done his job. Desmond Doss did not reject war by avoiding it. He entered it fully and refused only one thing. He would not take a life. Everything else he accepted: the danger, the isolation, the consequences of staying behind when others were permitted to leave. His story is often framed as an exception, a singular case that proves a point. It is more accurately understood as a reminder that courage does not require violence, that conviction does not require dominance, that in the most extreme conditions, restraint can be as demanding as force. On Hacksaw Ridge, the fighting continued after he was carried down. The ridge changed hands. The war moved on. But for the men who were lowered over the edge that night, the defining moment of the battle was not an attack or a withdrawal. It was the sound of a rope tightening, and the knowledge that someone was still there. The memory of that night followed the survivors long after Okinawa fell quiet. They did not remember speeches or commands. They remembered hands pulling them through smoke, the scrape of boots on rock, the pause before the rope went taut, and they felt themselves lowered into darkness, alive when they had expected nothing else. For Doss, the attention that followed was uncomfortable. He had never set out to make a statement. His refusal to carry a weapon was not protest. It was obedience to a belief he had never learned to separate from action. He did not argue theory. He accepted consequence. That distinction mattered to him. In training, he had learned how fragile conviction looked under pressure. Mockery had been easy. Isolation had been harder. What sustained him was routine. Wake up. Report in. Do the work assigned. When challenged, he did not escalate. He waited. Time, he believed, would reveal what argument could not. Combat did that work for him. Under fire, the calculus changed. The men who had once questioned him did not ask what he believed. They asked where he was. Medics were always in short supply. A medic who stayed when others could not was not evaluated by doctrine. He was evaluated by presence. Doss never ran toward danger. He moved toward injury. That difference mattered. He did not seek exposure. He accepted it as a condition of his role. Each movement was deliberate, each decision constrained by the same question: is there someone still alive? On Hacksaw Ridge, that question repeated itself until exhaustion replaced fear. The work became mechanical. Treat, drag, tie, lower, pray, repeat. The pattern held until it could not continue any longer. After the war, the world tried to place him in a category: conscientious objector, pacifist, hero, none fit comfortably. He rejected the labels without hostility. He did not deny them. He simply did not use them. They did not describe how the day had unfolded. What he carried home was not triumph. It was damage. His lungs never fully recovered. His injuries limited his strength. His voice remained soft. He lived quietly, avoided crowds, and spoke rarely about what he had done unless asked directly. When he did speak, he returned to specifics, locations, times, actions. He did not frame his story as moral instruction. He described what happened and allowed others to decide what it meant. Desmond Doss did not save 75 men because he was fearless. He saved them because fear did not alter his obligation. He did not believe courage required dominance. He believed it required constancy. In a war that rewarded force, he practiced endurance. In an environment that encouraged aggression, he chose restraint without withdrawal. He did not stand apart from the men around him. He stood with them longer than most. Hacksaw Ridge is remembered for the violence that took it. For the men who survived that night, it is remembered for something quieter. One medic, one rope, repeated until there was no one left to carry. That was all. Time passed, and the story settled into record rather than rumor. The details were verified not by exaggeration, but by cross-checking. Names matched, wounds matched, positions matched. Men who had been assumed dead were alive because someone had counted them as worth the effort when the position was already written off. Doss did not correct the number. 75 became the estimate because it was the count that emerged from reports and recollection. He accepted it without emphasis. He did not treat it as an achievement. He treated it as the result of staying longer than expected. What distinguished him was not that he acted alone. It was that he accepted isolation as part of the task. When others withdrew under orders that were justified and necessary, he did not see departure as permission. He saw it as an opportunity to finish what had been started. He was not reckless. He used cover. He waited when movement would have been fatal. He understood the battlefield as well as anyone there. His survival was not luck alone. It was judgment applied repeatedly under pressure. The rope mattered because it was improvised. There was no evacuation plan for that moment, no designated equipment. He adapted what he had because adaptation was the only option left. The cliff did not care about belief or doctrine. It required a solution, and he provided one without commentary. In later years, when his actions were retold, people often searched for a turning point, a moment when he decided to do something extraordinary. There was no such moment. There was only continuity. He had refused to carry a weapon long before Okinawa. He had accepted the cost of that refusal long before Hacksaw Ridge. When the night came, he did not change. The situation did. The war eventually absorbed his story and moved past it. Battles concluded. Fronts shifted. Headlines changed. But the account remained intact because it did not rely on symbolism. It relied on fact. One man remained. Men were lowered. Lives were preserved. Desmond Doss never argued that his way should replace anyone else's. He did not ask others to fight differently. He asked only to serve without violating what he believed. The Army resisted that request until it became impossible to deny its result. In the end, his story endures not because it is unique, but because it is specific. A location, a time, a decision repeated until the body failed. It does not offer a lesson that applies everywhere. It offers an example that applies exactly where it occurred. On a ridge where most men were ordered to leave, one man stayed, not to prove a point, to finish the work. When people later tried to explain why he stayed, they often reached for language that did not belong to him. Words like destiny or calling appeared in retellings. Doss never used them. He described his actions as obligation, not inspiration. The distinction mattered. Inspiration can fade. Obligation does not negotiate. What he carried onto Hacksaw Ridge was not a desire to be tested. It was preparation. He had learned how to treat wounds quickly because delay killed. He had learned how to move under fire because panic wasted time. He had learned how to work alone because he had often been left that way long before combat began. The ridge itself offered no protection. The ground was torn open by artillery. Japanese positions were concealed, overlapping, disciplined. Darkness did not bring safety. It only reduced visibility. Every movement carried risk. Doss accepted that risk without framing it as sacrifice. It was simply the condition under which the work had to be done. There were moments when he nearly failed. Exhaustion blurred judgment. Blood loss slowed him. The weight of bodies dragged across stone reduced his strength with every trip. He did not deny those limits. He adjusted around them. Shorter drags, longer pauses. One more knot, one more prayer. Not for survival, for capacity. When there was finally no one else to find, he stopped. Not because he was finished, but because the ridge was. Silence returned unevenly. Fire receded. The work ended because there was nothing left to do. That, more than anything else, defined the night. Afterward, he did not seek distance from the men he had saved. He did not claim authority over them. He returned to his role and continued working where he was needed. The war did not elevate him beyond the consequences it imposed. It carried on, indifferent to individual endurance. Recognition came later, and it was formal. The citation was precise. Dates, actions, distances. No adjectives that could not be supported. The Medal of Honor did not describe belief. It described behavior under fire. That distinction preserved the account from myth. Doss accepted the medal as he accepted everything else. Quietly, without correction, without expansion. He did not use it to argue a position. He treated it as acknowledgement that what he had done was visible, not exceptional. He never suggested that violence was unnecessary. He understood the war he had been part of. He did not judge those who fought differently. He simply demonstrated that another path could exist alongside it, even in the most extreme conditions. Hacksaw Ridge did not become safer because he was there. It remained lethal. Men continued to die. The outcome of the battle was decided by forces far larger than one medic. What changed was narrower, more precise. 75 men lived. They lived because someone who had been told he did not belong stayed long enough to matter. That is where his story ends. Not with a victory, with a presence that refused to withdraw. The war did not pause to absorb what had happened. Okinawa continued to cost lives. Positions were taken and lost. Orders changed. Casualties accumulated. The ridge became another coordinate on a map crowded with them. But within the unit, something had shifted quietly and permanently. Men who had once measured reliability by firepower began measuring it by endurance. Not who advanced fastest, but who remained when movement stopped making sense. Doss did not redefine courage for them in words. He did it by staying present when absence would have been excused. He never claimed that his refusal to carry a weapon made him better than anyone else. He knew what the fighting required. He saw it up close. He treated the results of it with his hands. He understood that without rifles, the wounded he saved would not have been wounded at all, but they also would not have been alive without someone willing to move toward them unarmed. That contradiction never troubled him. He accepted it as reality. War was not clean. Conviction did not simplify it. Conviction only defined what one person would and would not do within it. In later years, audiences asked him whether he was afraid that night. He answered honestly. Yes. Fear had been constant. Fear had never left. What mattered was that fear did not alter the task. It was acknowledged, then set aside, repeatedly, until exhaustion replaced it. There were no witnesses to most of what he did. Darkness concealed detail. Fire obscured movement. The ridge did not offer vantage points for observation. The story survived because men who had been unconscious woke up alive somewhere they should not have been. That outcome did not require interpretation. The Army, which once saw his refusal as a liability, ultimately recorded it as part of his qualification. Not because belief was rewarded, but because outcome could not be denied. Doctrine adjusted not in theory, but in practice. Medics were valued differently afterward. Presence mattered. Doss returned to civilian life without seeking a platform. He did not tour bases to instruct others how to be like him. He did not claim that his path should be repeated. He lived with the consequences of his injuries and the memory of the men he could not reach in time. Those absences stayed with him. He did not speak about them often. When he did, he spoke of them plainly. There had been moments when he arrived too late, moments when the rope was not enough. He did not count those. He remembered them. Hacksaw Ridge entered history as a battle defined by ferocity and loss. Within that account, his actions occupy a narrow space. They do not explain the battle. They do not redeem it. They do not soften its cost. They demonstrate something smaller and harder to dismiss. That even in an environment structured around killing, it was possible to choose not to take a life and still refuse to abandon the field. That choice did not change the war. It changed the fate of the men who were still breathing when he found them. That distinction is what keeps his story from dissolving into symbolism. Desmond Doss did not stand apart from the war. He stood inside it, accepting its conditions without accepting its most common demand. He did not remove himself from danger to preserve his beliefs. He placed himself in greater danger to honor them. The men who fought beside him understood that difference instinctively. They did not see idealism. They saw reliability. When someone went down, they knew where the medic would be. When fire intensified, they knew he would not leave first. That knowledge mattered more than agreement. After Okinawa, as units rotated out and the war drew toward its end, Doss's name did not circulate as legend. It circulated as fact, as something that had happened and could not be undone or dismissed. The story did not grow with retelling because it did not need to. It remained anchored to place and action. Hacksaw Ridge itself did not preserve memory. It eroded like any other piece of contested ground. Vegetation returned. Positions disappeared. The cliff remained. What endured was carried by men who had felt themselves lowered into darkness by someone they had once doubted. Doss never framed that moment as proof of anything. He did not argue that his faith had been vindicated. He argued only that he had been allowed to do his job. That permission had come late, under pressure, and at cost. But it had come. When he spoke to younger audiences years later, he did not encourage imitation. He encouraged seriousness, about belief, about responsibility, about understanding the weight of staying when others leave. He did not promise protection. He promised consequence. The Medal of Honor placed him in a category that never sat comfortably with him. He accepted it because refusal would have redirected attention away from the men he had served with. He wore it without performance. He spoke about it without elevation. It marked recognition, not identity. In the end, Desmond Doss did not offer a lesson about pacifism or heroism in the abstract. He offered a record: one man, one night, one ridge, and a decision repeated until there was nothing left to do. He did not argue with war. He endured it on his own terms. And when the fighting moved on, when the ridge fell silent, and when history closed the chapter, what remained was not a speech or a principle. It was the fact that 75 men lived because someone chose not to leave when leaving was allowed. That is where the story rests. After everything that followed, the story resisted conclusion. It did not resolve neatly into lesson or warning. It remained what it had always been, a sequence of actions taken under pressure, without witnesses, without guarantee, and without expectation of recognition. Doss did not believe he had altered how war should be fought. He believed only that he had been placed where people were injured, and that leaving them would have been wrong. That belief did not require validation, it required endurance. And endurance, unlike ideology, can be measured. Measured in distance dragged across broken ground. Measured in minutes spent exposed to fire. Measured in strength that failed only after the work was finished. He never separated faith from effort. Prayer did not replace action. It punctuated it. Between each descent, between each knot, between each decision to move again when exhaustion suggested stopping. Faith, for him, was not exemption from fear. It was a refusal to let fear dictate outcome. The men who survived did not remember doctrine. They remembered being found. They remembered hands on their shoulders when they had assumed no one was coming. In war, that moment defines everything that follows. Doss lived long enough to see his story retold, interpreted, simplified, and dramatized. He did not correct most of it. He understood that distance changes stories. He did not fight that. He returned when asked to what could not change. He had stayed. He had worked. Others had lived. Hacksaw Ridge did not become sacred ground. It became history. The war moved on. The world changed. But the account remained intact because it did not rely on myth. It relied on a refusal to abandon responsibility when it became optional. In the end, Desmond Doss did not redefine heroism. He narrowed it. He showed that heroism could be quiet, that it could be repetitive, that it could look like work done after others had been ordered to stop. He saved 75 men without taking a life, not by standing apart from the war, but by staying inside it longer than anyone expected. What makes his story endure is not the scale of what he did, but the conditions under which he did it. Hacksaw Ridge was not a moment designed for individual action. It was a moment defined by breakdown. Orders had failed. Assaults had stalled. The position had been written off temporarily because holding it any longer meant unacceptable loss. In that vacuum, responsibility usually dissolves. Doss did not allow it to. He was not improvising courage, he was applying discipline. Everything he did that night followed the same internal rule he had followed since training. If someone is wounded and reachable, you go to them. If they are alive, you stabilize them. If they can be moved, you move them. If you cannot move them, you stay until you can do something more. There was no escalation beyond that, no calculation of odds, no assessment of personal outcome. That kind of thinking is rare in combat because combat encourages triage of a different sort. Objectives over individuals, positions over bodies, withdrawal over persistence. Doss did not reject those priorities for others. He simply did not apply them to himself. The Army eventually recognized that distinction, not because it aligned with doctrine, but because it did not undermine it. His actions did not cause confusion. They did not interfere with command. They filled a gap left when the system reached its limit. He operated where structure had ended. In later analysis of the battle, his actions are often described as exceptional. They were, but they were not chaotic. They were controlled, repetitive, and physically punishing in a way that left no room for drama. Each descent of the rope was identical in process and different only in the condition of the man being lowered. That repetition is what made the number grow. Doss himself resisted abstraction. He did not speak about saving lives as a concept. He spoke about men by name when he could remember them, about how heavy they were, about whether they could hold on, about whether they were conscious enough to help. These details mattered more to him than totals. When he was finally ordered off the ridge days later because his injuries made him a liability to himself, he complied without protest. Obedience had never been the issue. The issue had always been whether obedience required him to violate what he believed was right. In that case, it did not. After the war, his life was quieter than the story attached to it. Illness limited his work. Pain became routine. He did not seek distance from what he had done, but he did not relive it either. He lived with the understanding that the night on the ridge was not something to be replicated. It was something that had occurred because circumstances demanded it, and because he had not stepped away. When people asked him whether he would do it again, he answered carefully. He did not romanticize the cost. He did not claim certainty about future strength. He said only that he hoped he would be faithful to what he believed if asked again. That was as far as he went. The power of his story lies there, not in assurance, but in commitment without guarantee. He did not know he would survive. He did not know how many men were still alive. He did not know whether staying would matter. He stayed anyway. In war, most outcomes are decided by force applied at scale. Hacksaw Ridge was no exception. But within that scale, individual actions still shape who lives long enough to see the end of the battle. Doss operated entirely within that narrow margin. He did not claim victory. He did not claim righteousness. He claimed responsibility, and he accepted its cost without complaint. That is why his story remains difficult to simplify. It does not argue against war. It does not redeem it. It does not suggest that violence can be replaced by belief. It shows that even in the most violent environments, there is room for choice, and that sometimes the most consequential choice is not to advance or retreat, but to remain where others cannot. That is where Desmond Doss stood, and that is why his name endures. By the time the fighting on Okinawa moved beyond the escarpment, what Doss had done was already complete. There was no final stand, no last gesture to mark the end of his part in it. The work ended the way it had been carried out, when there was nothing left that could be done without abandoning someone else first. The men who survived because of him returned to the line, altered in ways that were not visible on reports. They did not become quieter or louder. They did not speak differently. They simply knew, with a certainty that required no explanation, that the boundaries they had assumed in combat were not fixed. Someone had crossed them without breaking. Doss himself was removed from the front not as a hero, but as a casualty. His injuries were serious enough that staying would have endangered others. He accepted the order without protest. Staying had never been about defiance. It had been about presence, and presence had limits. As the battle receded into memory, the Army formalized what had happened. Statements were collected. Officers testified. Survivors identified locations and times. The account narrowed, sharpened, and lost nothing in the process. The more precise it became, the less room there was for disbelief. What remained undeniable was simple. On Hacksaw Ridge, when withdrawal was authorized and survival favored leaving, one medic stayed. He stayed long enough to lower 75 wounded men to safety. He did it without a weapon. He did it under fire. He did it until exhaustion and injury made continuation impossible. The Army eventually recognized the action with its highest award. Desmond Doss stood quietly as the citation was read. It described distances, wounds, and hours under fire. It did not attempt to explain motivation. It did not need to. Recognition did not conclude the story. It fixed it in place. What followed for Doss was not elevation, but return. Return to a body that no longer functioned as it once had. Return to a life shaped by illness and pain that never fully receded. Return to a memory that did not seek attention but did not release him either. He did not frame what he had done as exceptional. He framed it as unfinished work that happened to end. Others could debate meaning. He accepted consequence. As years passed, the war receded, then hardened into history. The ridge became terrain again. The names of battles shifted into textbooks. But the account of that night resisted compression. It remained intact because it rested on decision rather than interpretation. The war did not pause for what he did. It did not change direction. It absorbed the act and moved on. But for the men who were carried over the edge when they had already been counted as lost, the war had ended differently, not with an order, with someone still there. The final measure of what Desmond Doss did is not found in the medal or in the number attached to his name. It is found in how little space his actions occupy in the machinery of war, and how much they mattered anyway. Nothing he did altered strategy. Nothing he did changed command decisions. Hacksaw Ridge was taken because of sustained assaults, artillery, and loss accepted at scale. The war moved forward because of force applied over time. Doss did not interfere with that. He did not challenge it. He worked beneath it, in the narrow margin where individuals still live or die, regardless of outcomes decided elsewhere. That margin is where his story belongs. He did not act because he believed the war was wrong. He acted because someone was wounded. He did not stay because he believed he would succeed. He stayed because leaving would have meant accepting that someone reachable would be abandoned. That was the only calculation he allowed himself. When the night ended and he was finally carried down, the ridge did not feel different. The danger remained. The enemy remained. The bodies that could not be reached remained. There was no sense of completion, only exhaustion and the quiet knowledge that he had gone as far as his strength allowed. The men who survived carried that knowledge with them, not as inspiration, but as certainty. They had been found when they should not have been. They had been moved when movement seemed impossible. They had lived not because the battle turned in their favor, but because someone refused to stop working when the system around him had already moved on. Doss never claimed ownership of that outcome. He did not frame it as salvation. He framed it as responsibility, fulfilled imperfectly. He spoke more readily about those he could not save than those he did. He did not count lives as proof. He counted effort as obligation. After the war, the world tried to place his actions into a category it could understand. Pacifist hero, reluctant warrior. Exception to the rule. None of those fully applied. He was not an argument. He was a record, a man who entered combat without a weapon and accepted all the risk that choice carried. A man who was doubted, isolated, and nearly removed before he was ever tested. A man who stayed behind when leaving was permitted and expected. There was no moment when he overcame fear. Fear was present throughout. What distinguished him was not its absence, but its irrelevance. Fear did not decide his actions. Obligation did. The war ended. Time passed. Stories simplified. The ridge became quieter than it had ever been. But the account did not fade, because it was not built on exaggeration. It was built on repetition, one wounded man after another, lowered into darkness, alive. Desmond Doss did not redefine war. He did not redeem it. He did not offer a template for how it should be fought. He demonstrated something narrower and more difficult, that even in a system designed around destruction, there is still room for a single person to act without contributing to it. That conviction does not require withdrawal. That courage does not require violence. He stood where he was needed until he could no longer stand at all. And when he finally left the ridge, the only thing he took with him was what he had brought in the first place, a refusal to walk away from the wounded. That is where his story ends, not with victory, not with transformation, but with 75 men who lived because someone stayed when staying no longer made sense.